History is, I mean, it's full of monsters who are absolutely convinced they were just defending themselves.
Entirely, yeah. Almost no one thinks they're the villain in their own story.
Exactly. So, have you ever wondered how to actually build a system that tests that claim? Like how to systematically separate true, justified self-defense from, just masked violence?
Right. A way to actually engineer a safeguard against that kind of self-delusion.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are looking at what I can really only describe as a literal engineering blueprint for human morality.
It's arguably one of the most ambitious attempts to solve the oldest problem in human history.
Hmm.
We're looking at a system that doesn't just, politely ask people to be good.
Right.
It structurally forces them to prove it.
Prove it under the most extreme pressure imaginable. So here's the overview for today. We are examining a highly concentrated excerpt from a text called The Peaceful World Blueprint, version 1.0.
And just for context, this document as a whole is incredibly vast.
Oh, massive. But we have a very singular, intense focus today. We are zooming in entirely on one specific section. It's point 14, which is titled The Last Frontier, the Tragic Imperative of Defense.
Which is just a fascinating title right out of the gate.
It really is. And the mission for this deep dive, for all of you listening, is to meticulously unpack this single framework. Because the authors aren't writing abstract philosophy here, are they?
No, not at all.
Eh?
They are treating societal violence, and specifically the justified use of force, as a pure systems engineering problem.
Right, like building a bridge or, a nuclear reactor.
Exactly. They're asking, how do you engineer a framework that prevents force from corrupting the very people who are, forced to use it just to survive?
And before we get to the specific rules of engagement, which are intense, by the way, we have to look at the foundational philosophy this text establishes.
We really do, because it completely flips our normal understanding of defense.
Right, because the text explicitly states that armed defense is not the ideal. It says it should never become the norm. In fact, it frames defense entirely as a marker that the prevention system has failed. The true ideal, their primary strength, is prevention and nonviolent defense.
We have to just pause and appreciate the profound paradigm shift this requires from us, like as readers and as a society.
Yeah, it's jarring.
It is. Because throughout human history, we have consistently heroized armed defense. I mean, think about it.
Oh, absolutely. Parades, movies.
Right. We build colossal statues to the defenders in city squares. We hold these massive military parades. We write epic poems and, make blockbuster films about the glorious use of force to protect the homeland.
The brave hero making the ultimate stand.
Exactly. But point 14 strips all of that glory away completely. It reclassifies what we historically call heroic defense strictly as a systemic failure.
It calls it the tragic imperative. And I really want to break that specific phrasing down because tragic imperative is, it's an incredible pairing of words.
It's very deliberate.
Yeah, it feels almost contradictory at first glance. Like how can something be imperative and tragic at the same time?
It is incredibly precise language. Let's look at the word imperative first.
Okay.
An imperative means it is absolutely necessary. It's unavoidable. The text does not live in some, utopian fantasy world where violence just magically doesn't exist anymore.
Right. They aren't naive.
No, they acknowledge that there are moments, specifically in the face of an existential threat, where you literally have no choice but to act. You are compelled by just the biological and moral imperative to survive.
Right. You are pushed to the absolute edge of the cliff.
Exactly. You're backed into a corner. But then, and this is the genius of it, they attach the word tragic to it.
Tragic.
Tragic, meaning it is never, ever something to celebrate.
Even if you win?
Even if you win. Even if you are 100% justified. Even if you are actively saving innocent lives from a terrible threat. The moment you have to use lethal force, it is a tragedy.
Because you had to break the fundamental rule.
Yes. It's a loss for humanity as a whole.
Yeah.
You've crossed a line that you can never really uncross, and the authors want that immense weight to be felt by everyone involved.
It's kind of like, think of a fire extinguisher in a beautifully designed, state-of-the-art building.
Okay, I like that.
You absolutely must have it, right? It's an imperative. It's against code not to have one.
Sure.
But if you actually have to walk over, break the glass, pull the pin, and use it to put out a fire, it means the smoke detectors, the heat sensors, the fire retardant materials, the entire prevention protocol has fundamentally failed.
That is a very apt analogy.
Like, you don't throw a party because you successfully used the fire extinguisher.
Oh.
You launch a massive investigation into why the building caught fire in the first place.
Exactly. The use of the extinguisher is the tragic imperative. I mean, yes, it saves the building, thank goodness, but the fact that you needed it means your architecture was deeply flawed somewhere.
But let me push back on this a little bit, because I think this is where the philosophy meets, messy human psychology.
Go for it.
If we frame all defense as a failure of the system, doesn't that demoralize the very people tasked with protecting us?
How do you mean?
Well, if you tell a defender, like a soldier or a protector, hey, your job is a symbol of our failure, how do they carry that weight? It seems like it would just crush their morale.
That's a really vital question. It's a heavy burden to place on someone, but acknowledging the tragedy doesn't diminish the necessity of the defense.
Right.
Rather, it elevates the gravity of the act itself. Think about the psychology of glory for a second.
Okay.
If you treat defense as a glorious thing, you inevitably invite people to seek glory. You incentivize conflict. You get people who want to be heroes.
Ah, I see. The hero complex.
Exactly. But if you treat it as a tragic, heavy burden, you ensure it is never taken lightly. It demands that the people who wield this force do so with a profound sense of sorrow and solemnity, rather than, self-righteousness or bloodlust.
We need to force his humility.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is actually the ultimate safeguard against the intoxicating nature of violence. Violence is intoxicating, and glory is the drug that makes it go down easy. Point 14 takes the drug away.
Wow. Okay. So we established this incredibly heavy baseline. And that tension between knowing force is a tragic failure, but also an absolute unavoidable necessity. That brings us to the text's most critical dividing line.
Yes, the boundary.
Right. In the face of an existential threat, Point 14 draws a strict, unyielding boundary between two concepts. They define them as aggressive violence and protective force.
And we really need to be very clear about what constitutes an existential threat before we even look at that boundary.
Yeah, what's the baseline for even entering this framework?
The text isn't talking about like an insult to your honor or a border dispute over an empty patch of land or some ideological disagreement.
Right, this isn't for Twitter beefs or political arguments.
Exactly. An existential threat means the literal survival of a life or a group of lives is actively on the line. They will cease to exist if action isn't taken. Only when you are standing on that specific cliff does this framework apply.
Okay, so we are on the cliff. We are facing the threat. The blueprint says we must separate aggressive violence from protective force. The text defines aggressive violence by its goal: subjugation.
Right.
The desire to dominate, to conquer, to bend another human being or a whole society to your will. Protective force, on the other hand, is defined solely by one goal: the protection of life, period.
And the defining architecture here is intent and the end goal.
Intent is the key.
It is.
Yeah.
What's crucial to understand is that in the physical world, in the actual chaos of a conflict, the physical actions of aggressive violence and protective force might look terrifyingly similar.
Yeah, to someone just watching it happen.
Exactly. A weapon is fired, a structure is destroyed, a life is tragically taken. To the outside observer, the physical mechanics are identical, but the internal machinery, the purpose driving the action, is entirely different.
Oh, so?
Subjugation seeks to control the future. Protective force merely seeks to ensure there is a future at all. It just wants the threat to stop so life can continue.
Okay, let me stop you right there, because this is where the semantic loophole opens up wide enough to, drive a tank through.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Right, because everyone who starts a conflict claims they are just using protective force.
Oh, absolutely.
No one raises their hand on the world stage and says, "Hi, yes, I am doing aggressive violence for the purpose of subjugation today."
Yeah, the bad guys never wear name tags that say bad guy.
Exactly. Every dictator, every aggressor, they always wrap their actions in the language of defense. They say, we are protecting our historical rights, or we are defending ourselves from future threats. So how does this text prevent that massive historical loophole from just ruining the whole system?
That is the core vulnerability of human conflict right there. And what's so brilliant about point 14 is that the authors know this.
They anticipate the lie.
They do. They know that intention can be easily faked.
Yeah.
And honestly, even worse, it can be a product of deep self-delusion.
Oh, that's dangerous.
Very.
Mhm.
Humans are incredibly gifted at convincing themselves that their aggression is actually righteous defense.
We justify everything we do.
We do. So philosophy alone, just defining the terms on paper, is completely inadequate. If we just rely on people self-reporting their good intentions, the system fails immediately. it collapses.
Because subjective intent isn't enough to prevent arbitrary violence.
Exactly. And that is precisely why the text pivots right here from philosophy to engineering.
Ah.
To prevent protection from becoming arbitrary violence, the authors introduce a strict mechanical protocol to test that intent in the real world.
They don't just take your word for it.
Nope. They call it the protocol of extreme necessity. Or, as it's more commonly known in the text, the 5 locks.
The 5 locks.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are moving from the philosophical boundary into what we can call the architecture of constraint.
Yes. And the metaphor of the locks is very intentional here.
Why locks?
Well, think about how we secure our most dangerous, world-ending weapons today. Think about a nuclear launch sequence.
Right, it's never just a big red button on someone's desk, despite what movies show.
No, absolutely not. It requires multiple keys held by different people, turned simultaneously after passing through, layers and layers of authentication.
You can't do it alone.
Right. You have to pass through sequential barriers to authorize the unthinkable. The text treats the use of human force with the exact same gravity.
Oh.
These aren't just 5 guidelines. There aren't 5 helpful suggestions to keep in mind if you have time. They are 5 rigid conditions that must be met simultaneously.
So if one lock is closed.
If even one lock remains closed, the action is entirely unauthorized and it becomes aggressive violence by default. There is no gray area.
No gray area. Okay, let's test this machinery. Let's look at the first key. Lock 1 is called legitimacy.
Yes.
And the text defines it simply. The decision cannot be unilateral.
This is a direct structural strike against the concept of the lone hero or the rogue actor or, the absolute dictator.
The guy who just decides to take matters into his own hands.
Exactly. The text explicitly forbids a single person from making the decision to cross the line into lethal force. It requires collective decision-making. It demands consensus.
I really want to ground this in everyday psychology for you listening. Think about the absolute worst decisions you've ever made in your life.
Oh, boy.
Right. I bet you made them alone. You were in the heat of the moment. Your emotions were spiking. Your adrenaline was pumping. And you didn't consult a single other person. You just reacted.
We've all been there.
Yeah. And this first lock takes that very human, very flawed tendency to panic or give in to ego, and it scales it up to a systemic level. It says, you cannot be trusted to make this call alone.
It is essentially a forced circuit breaker.
A circuit breaker. I like that.
Yeah, because individuals are highly prone to cognitive bias. We're prone to misreading situations, to paranoia, to fear.
Especially in a crisis.
Exactly. So when you require legitimacy, when you require another human being or a group of human beings to look at the exact same data and say, yes, we agree this is an existential threat, you are forcing a pause.
You're slowing everything down.
You're forcing the individual to articulate the threat and justify the response before the trigger is pulled. You have to convince someone else you aren't crazy.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here because I know what people are thinking.
Go ahead.
If a sniper is actively shooting at my town, or, if an attacker breaks into a home right now, I shouldn't have to call a town hall meeting to authorize returning fire.
All right.
Like, how does consensus work when seconds matter and lives are actively being lost? Doesn't lock 1 just completely paralyze the defender?
It's a critical distinction to make, and it's a fair pushback.
Right.
The blueprint is generally addressing systemic, societal, or group-level deployments of force, like nations or communities going to war.
Okay, the macro level.
Right. However, even in the micro scenario of immediate self-defense, the principle of legitimacy still applies in how a society structures its laws.
How do you mean?
Well, a police officer might have to make a split-second decision alone in an alleyway, but that decision is governed by a consensus-built legal framework. Society had a meeting beforehand and authorized them to carry that weapon under highly specific conditions.
Ah, so the consensus happened before the crisis.
Yes. But you're right, in the macro sense, the main point of Lock 1 is to prevent one leader from waking up angry, feeling slighted, and just launching a war unilaterally.
Right. So collective consensus prevents a lone rogue actor. Lock 1 is open, but groups form mobs all the time.
Oh, definitely.
History is full of unified groups doing horrific things. Just because a group agrees doesn't mean their action is just or right. So how does the blueprint prevent a unified group from just, rushing into violence together?
By attacking their timeline and their alternatives. That's the genius of the next constraint in the system.
Which is Lock 2.
Lock 2 is ultima ratio.
Ultima ratio, which translates to the extreme measure of the final argument.
Exactly. And the text states that force is permissible only when there is a direct threat to life. and when all nonviolent means have been completely exhausted.
The absolute last resort.
Let's really look at the dual conditions the text places on this lock, because they are strict. First, the threat must be direct, and it must be against life.
Against life, not property.
Right.
Not a stolen car, not a hacked bank account, not a burning building that's empty.
Not property, and critically, not abstract concepts of national honor or reputation, or even political borders in a vacuum. The threat must be to human biology, to life itself.
That's a massive restriction right there.
It is. And then there's the second condition, which is an even heavier burden. The absolute exhaustion of nonviolent means.
I really want to dig into that word, exhausted.
Yeah, it's the key word.
Because in political rhetoric, we hear leaders say all the time, well, we tried everything, we have no choice but to attack.
Right, they say it on the news every night.
Yeah. But in reality, they made one phone call, didn't like the answer they got, and then sent in the troops. What does it practically mean to exhaust nonviolent means under this specific blueprint?
That is the strict, uncompromising interpretation of the text we have to look at. To exhaust means to drain completely. It implies active, desperate, incredibly creative attempts at de-escalation.
Not just checking a box.
No, not at all. Think of a high-stakes hostage negotiation. The negotiator doesn't just call once, ask the hostage taker to come out, and when the guy says no, just hang up and signal the tactical team to breach the building.
Right, they don't give up after 5 minutes.
They stay on the phone for hours, sometimes days. They offer food, they bring in family members, they try psychological tactics, they look for literally every conceivable off-ramp to avoid shooting.
Yeah. If the negotiator walks away from the command post while the phone is still ringing and the hostage taker is still talking, they haven't exhausted their options. They just got tired.
Precisely. And that's exactly what Lock 2 demands. If you use force, while a diplomatic, economic, or physical escape route still exists, even if that escape route is deeply inconvenient or, frankly, humiliating, you fail the ultima ratio lock.
Wow. Even if it's humiliating, so you have to swallow your pride.
You absolutely have to swallow your pride. If there's a way out that doesn't involve blood, you have to take it. If you don't, you are no longer engaging in the tragic imperative. You are making an active choice for violence.
The blueprint demands that you systematically dismantle every other choice before acting.
It forces the defender to bear the absolute burden of proof. You have to empirically prove the absence of alternatives.
That is an incredibly high bar. It removes the, oh, we had no choice excuse entirely unless you can literally mathematically prove it.
The goal.
Okay, so let's say a society actually clears that hurdle. The group reaches consensus, passing Lock 1. And let's say every single nonviolent option, every negotiation, every sanction, every attempt to literally just pack up and flee has been tried and has definitively failed.
Okay, so the wall is at their back.
Right. The threat to life is imminent. Passing Lock 2. So the lock opens and force is finally authorized. Does the defending group now have a blank check to do whatever it takes to neutralize the threat?
Absolutely not.
Not at all.
Not even close. And this is where the architecture becomes incredibly rigid. How you apply that authorized force is strictly governed by Lock 3.
Lock 3 is minimal harm.
Yes.
And the PEC says the application of force must be strictly proportional to the threat. Furthermore, it must observe the principle of distinguishing between combatants and civilians and the precautionary principle.
This is undoubtedly the most technically dense and morally complex lock in the entire blueprint.
Oh, it's intense. Let's break down its 3 components meticulously because I feel like this is where the high-level theory really hits the messy, chaotic reality of conflict.
It is.
Let's start with proportionality.
Okay. Proportionality dictates that you only use exactly enough force to stop the threat, and not a fraction of an ounce more. You must dynamically scale your response to the danger as it unfolds in real time.
If I'm understanding this correctly, it means if someone comes at you with a wooden club, you don't call in an airstrike on their house.
Correct. You use just enough force to disarm the club.
But let me push back on how realistic this really is.
Sure.
That mathematical calculus is super easy to do right now, sitting here in a studio analyzing it safely in hindsight.
Of course.
But imagine you are in the actual chaos of an existential threat. Adrenaline is dumping into your system, your vision is tunneling, your fine motor skills are degrading.
It's terrifying.
Right. Isn't demanding strict proportionality asking a defender to do, complex moral calculus while actively fighting for their very survival? Isn't that asking too much of a human being?
It is an immense, almost superhuman demand. The authors of the text don't shy away from that at all.
They know it's hard.
They know it's nearly impossible. But that ties directly back to why defense is a tragic imperative. The protocol demands an excruciating standard of moral discipline precisely because the stakes are life and death.
So the difficulty isn't a bug, it's a feature.
Exactly. The difficulty of the calculus isn't a flaw in the system. It is the entire point. It acts as a massive drag force against the natural biological human instinct to overreact.
Because our instinct is to smash the threat until it's dust.
Right. We want to seek vengeance, to annihilate a threat entirely so we never ever have to worry about it again. We want to be safe forever.
It's a friction built into the system to prevent a justified defense from rapidly sliding into total, uncontrolled war.
Exactly. It forces restraint in the very environment where restraint is hardest to maintain. And that leads directly to the second component of Lock 3, the principle of distinction.
Right, distinguishing between combatants and civilians.
This is the absolute non-negotiable moral imperative to differentiate between those causing the harm and innocent bystanders.
You can't just generalize the threat.
No. You cannot treat an entire population, an entire city, or an entire demographic as a threat. You must isolate and target only the active threat itself.
Which again, in modern conflict, where combatants often hide among civilians, is incredibly difficult.
It is a nightmare to execute.
But the blueprint basically says it doesn't care if it's difficult. It says if you can't distinguish the guilty from the innocent, you fail the lock. You don't get to shoot.
Yes. And it goes even further with the third component, which is the precautionary principle.
This one blew my mind when I read it.
It's intense. This goes way beyond just trying to distinguish targets. The precautionary principle is the active structural obligation to take steps to avoid accidental harm.
So if I'm understanding the precautionary principle correctly, it means I can't just drop a bomb on a facility if there's even a slight chance civilians are inside.
Right.
I have to actually send in a ground team at a much greater risk to myself and my own team to ensure civilians aren't harmed. Is that what this really means?
Yes, that is exactly what it means. It is the concept of risk absorption.
Risk absorption.
In every single scenario, you are mandated to choose the path of least collateral damage, even if, and especially if, that path decreases your own safety.
Wow.
Think of a variation of the classic trolley problem.
Oh, the classic ethical dilemma.
Right. A runaway train is heading toward your group. You can pull a lever and switch the tracks to save yourselves, but the only other track has an innocent bystander standing on it.
Normally, people argue about the utility of saving 5 lives versus 1.
But the precautionary principle entirely alters the calculus here. It says you cannot knowingly transfer the existential threat onto an innocent third party just to save yourself.
Even if there are more of you.
Even then,
Yeah.
you are mandated to absorb the risk. You must prioritize the safety of bystanders over your own convenience or even your own absolute safety.
That is just a staggering burden to place on the defender. Let's just list it out. You have to wait until the absolute last resort. You can only use minimal proportional force. You have to sort the guilty from the innocent in real-time chaos. And you have to willingly absorb physical risk to protect bystanders who have absolutely nothing to do with the conflict.
That's the protocol.
It almost sounds like the blueprint is trying to make defense impossible. Like they don't want anyone to survive.
It is trying to make arbitrary, careless defense impossible.
Okay, that's a good way to put it.
The text argues that if you are not willing to carry that immense burden, if you are not willing to absorb that risk to protect the innocent, then you really have no moral right to use lethal force in the first place.
You haven't earned the right.
Exactly. You are not ready for the terrifying responsibility of the tragic imperative. You are just looking for permission to do violence under the guise of defense.
That is a chilling but profoundly necessary standard. So, okay, let's assume the unimaginable has actually happened. A society was backed into a corner. The group agreed, passing Lock 1. It was the absolute last resort, passing Lock 2. And the force was applied with surgical precision, observing proportionality, and absorbing risk to protect bystanders, passing Lock 3.
So they threaded the needle perfectly.
Right. The threat is neutralized, the event is over, the locks have done their job, and everyone can go home.
Right. Not according to point 14.
Right. And this is where the blueprint really dramatically separates itself from historical doctrines of war.
It takes a hard left turn here.
Does the protocol end when the physical threat stops? No. The text demands that what happens after the defense is just as strictly governed as what happens before.
Lock 4 is accountability.
Accountability.
The text states, Any use of force is subject to mandatory public and legal audit.
I really want to emphasize that word.
It's vital.
It doesn't say an audit happens if things go wrong or, if there's a massive public outcry or if an investigative journalist uncovers some terrible scandal.
No, it's not conditional.
It says mandatory. It happens every single time force is used, no matter what.
And it says public and legal. This is crucial to the architecture. It cannot be an internal review handled behind closed doors by the military or the police department that just use the force.
No investigating yourselves and finding no wrongdoing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It requires complete transparency to the broader society and strict adherence to established objective law.
Wait, let's look at the reality of human nature here again.
Always a good idea.
If my group just successfully defended our city, if we just saved thousands of lives from a terrifying existential threat.
You're the heroes.
Right. And now, while we are still bleeding, while you're exhausted and grieving our dead, you want to put us on trial to audit our actions.
It sounds incredibly ungrateful, doesn't it?
It does. Human nature dictates we're going to rebel against that instantly. The victors write the history books. How does the blueprint structurally enforce an audit over the people who just won the conflict and, frankly, hold all the weapons?
It's the ultimate test of the system's integrity. And to be fair, the text hasn't outlined the granular logistical mechanics of how the court is funded or staffed.
Okay, so it's a bit abstract there.
Yes, but what it does do is establish the non-negotiable societal principle that must be agreed upon before any conflict ever starts. It connects directly back to the prevention of arbitrariness we talked about earlier.
Okay, how so?
If a society truly adopts this blueprint, the defenders know with absolute certainty that every action they take, every trigger they pull, will be forensically examined in the cold light of day by the public and by the law.
It's like having a body camera on your soul.
Yes. It's the ultimate Hawthorne effect applied to societal conflict.
For those listening, the Hawthorne effect is that psychological phenomenon where individuals modify an aspect of their behavior simply because they know they are being observed.
Exactly. If you know the audit is inescapable, it fundamentally changes your psychology in the heat of the moment.
You can't just act on rage.
No, you can't. It establishes that no one, absolutely no one, gets a blank check for violence. Not even the good guys who are purely defending themselves.
Because even good guys can go too far.
Very easily. You do what you have to do to survive. But you must be prepared to stand before your peers, present your evidence, and justify every single step of that process through the lens of the first three locks.
You have to prove you didn't use a cannon on a guy with a stick.
Exactly. You have to show your math.
So accountability looks backward. It looks at the action that just happened, audits the data, and passes judgment.
Yes.
But the blueprint requires a final step. And I have to say, looking at all the historical doctrines, rules of engagement, and philosophical texts we've read for this show, this is perhaps the most unique, radical, and profound concept in the entire document.
It truly is a total departure from everything we normally study regarding conflict.
Yeah.
We've talked about restraint, we've talked about audits, but Lock 5 moves into an entirely different, almost spiritual dimension of societal engineering.
Lock 5 is the radical mandate of healing. Let me just read the exact phrasing from the text because it is so powerful. Quote, "The use of force automatically triggers obligations for restoration, helping victims, treating the moral trauma of defenders, and rebuilding broken ties. Healing is recognized as an inalienable debt that must be paid for the tragic decision to use force." End quote.
We really need to spend significant time unpacking this because it completely rewrites the script of human conflict from the ground up.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the operative word there, automatically.
Automatically. Healing isn't positioned as a charity. It isn't a nice thing to do if there's some money left over in the defense budget after all the weapons are restocked.
It's not an afterthought.
No, it is a structural requirement. Turning the key of force automatically locks you into the obligation of restoration. You literally cannot have one without the other in this system.
Let's analyze the three prongs of this restoration they mandate because they cover a lot of ground. The first one makes immediate sense to me. Helping victims.
That's the physical and economic recovery. Rebuilding the destroyed infrastructure, providing medical care to the wounded, securing food and water for the displaced.
Right, that addresses the visible physical damage of the conflict. We're used to seeing that kind of aid. But the second prong is what's truly revolutionary. It mandates treating the moral trauma of defenders.
This is a massive paradigm shift. It goes against the entire archetype of the stoic, unbothered warrior hero that we're so used to.
It really does. It acknowledges a devastating psychological truth that society almost always prefers to just ignore.
Which is?
That even justified violence severely damages the human being who wields it.
Even if they did the right thing.
Even then, the text recognizes that human beings are generally not psychologically built to take life. When a defender uses lethal force, even to save innocent people, even after perfectly passing the first 4 locks and doing absolutely everything right, they sustain a deep, invisible wound to their psyche.
It's what psychologists call moral injury, right?
Exactly. Moral injury is the idea that doing the quote-unquote right thing in a terrible, impossible situation can still fundamentally break your soul.
Because you had to violate a core human boundary.
Yes. It's the trauma not just of what was done to you in the fight, but what you had to do to survive.
Yeah.
And Log 5 says society cannot just hand that defender a medal, pat them on the back, call them a hero, and tell them to go back to normal life as if nothing happened.
Which is what we usually do.
It is. But society has an automatic structural obligation to treat their moral trauma.
Yeah.
We owe them extensive psychological healing for the terrifying burden they took on for our collective safety.
Let me try to visualize this because it's a profound concept.
Okay.
If I run and break down a heavy oak door to save someone trapped in a burning room, society might consider me a hero.
Absolutely.
But the physical reality is the door is still broken, the house is now exposed to the elements, and my shoulder is completely dislocated from the impact of hitting the door.
Right, you're injured.
The event isn't suddenly over just because the fire is out. We have to sweep up the ash, we have to fix the door so the house is secure, and we have to put my shoulder back into the socket, and I have to do months of painful physical therapy.
That is the perfect encapsulation of Lock 5. The fire is out, but the system is broken. The defender's shoulder is dislocated, mentally speaking.
Right.
And that brings us to the third prong of the healing mandate. Rebuilding broken ties.
Rebuilding ties with the enemy.
With the enemy or within a fractured community. It means fixing the social fabric itself.
Yeah.
Because conflict inevitably rips communities apart. It breeds deep hatred, paranoia, suspicion, and generational trauma.
It creates a cycle.
Exactly. Lock 5 demands that the work of defense isn't finished until the relationships between the opposing sides or within the fractured community have been actively addressed and repaired.
I hear that, and it's beautiful in theory, but let's be realistic about human behavior and resources here.
Okay, hit me.
In the aftermath of an existential threat, resources are usually totally decimated. Supply lines are broken, economies are ruined, people are starving.
It's chaos.
Pure chaos. How can a society realistically prioritize the psychological therapy of the fighters and rebuilding friendly ties with the people who just tried to kill them when they barely have enough food for the surviving victims? Isn't this lock just a luxury that only a wealthy, perfectly stable society can afford?
It sounds like a luxury, I admit. But the text aggressively argues it is the ultimate necessity.
Why?
Because if you do not treat the moral trauma of the defenders, and if you do not actively rebuild the broken ties with the aggressors, you guarantee that the violence will return.
It's just a pause, not an end.
Exactly. Untreated trauma and festering hatred are the raw fuel for the next conflict. The blueprint isn't demanding luxury, it's demanding structural integrity. If you skip Lock 5 because it's too hard or too expensive, you are simply resetting the clock for the next existential threat.
You're just planting the seeds for the next war.
Right.
I'm really struck by the phrasing at the very end of this point. It calls healing an inalienable debt.
Yes.
The act of using force incurs a deep societal, almost cosmic debt, and healing is the currency required to pay it off.
It completely rewrites the concept of victory.
It really does.
In the traditional historical model, victory is the parade. It's standing over the defeated enemy, planting the flag, dropping the confetti, and declaring the problem totally solved.
You won, let's go home.
Right. In the Point 14 model, there is no parade. There is no triumph. There is only the immediate commencement of the arduous, exhausting, probably decades-long work of healing.
You just traded one hard job for another.
Yes. Using force is essentially taking out a massive, high-interest loan against the future of humanity, and Lock 5 is the mandatory repayment plan.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and pull back to look at the whole picture. We've gone through an intense, highly theoretical, but deeply, deeply consequential journey unpacking Port 14 today.
It is a dense, challenging, but ultimately, I think, very hopeful framework. It demands the absolute best of us in our absolute worst moments.
Let's briefly recap the mechanics we've discovered just to lock it in. We started by looking at the foundational philosophy, recognizing that the use of force is never a triumph. It is a tragic imperative, a sorrowful marker that our systems of prevention have fundamentally failed.
Right. And we saw the strict boundary drawn between aggressive violence, which seeks only to subjugate, and protective force, which seeks strictly to preserve life.
And because human intent is deeply flawed, easily manipulated, and highly subjective, we examine the architecture of constraint, the protocol of extreme necessity, or the 5 locks.
Which have to all be opened simultaneously.
Right. Lock 1, legitimacy. The decision requires consensus. It can never be unilateral, preventing the rogue actor or the angry dictator.
Lock 2. Ultima ratio, the extreme measure. Force is the absolute last resort, triggered only by a direct threat to life when all nonviolent levers have been completely demonstrably exhausted.
Lock 3, minimal harm. The strict mathematical and moral calculus of proportionality, the rigid distinction between combatants and civilians, and the precautionary principle of actively absorbing risk to protect bystanders.
Lock 4. Accountability. The mandatory, uncompromising public and legal audit of every single action taken, ensuring no blank checks for violence are ever issued.
And finally, Lock 5, healing. The radical mandate that the use of force incurs an inalienable debt, requiring automatic structural obligations to help victims, treat the deep moral trauma of the defenders, and repair the torn social fabric.
It's an airtight system if a society has the discipline to actually run it.
So for you listening to this, why does this dense philosophical blueprint matter? How do you actually use this in your day-to-day life?
The immense value of this specific text at line 14 is that it gives you a rigorous mental model.
A tool?
Exactly. It is a diagnostic tool for the modern world. Whenever you are analyzing a conflict, whether you are reading a history book, watching the nightly news, or even debating the philosophy of self-defense with a friend, you no longer have to rely purely on your gut reaction or political tribalism.
You don't just have to pick a team.
No, you can hold that conflict up against these 5 locks. You can ask the hard questions. Did this action actually pass the Ultima ratio? Were all other diplomatic options truly exhausted, or were they just ignored because they were inconvenient?
Is there a mandatory audit happening, or are the victors actively hiding the evidence?
Right. Is anyone talking about the moral trauma of the defenders? Is there a structural plan for healing the community?
It gives you a way to see through the political rhetoric, the flags and the speeches, and evaluate the underlying mechanical reality of the force being used.
Precisely. It allows you to identify when protective force is quietly slipping into aggressive violence, even when it's heavily wrapped in the language of defense.
I really want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive today. Think back to that incredible phrase in Lock 5. The text calls healing an inalienable debt paid for the tragic decision to use force.
Yeah.
It's an engineering metaphor. We built the machine, we turned the keys, we unleashed the energy to save the building, and now we absolutely have to pay the immense cost for the energy that machine consumed. But look around at our world today. Look at our history books.
That's a sobering look.
It is. How many unpaid moral debts are currently piling up out there? How many times has society stopped at the use of force, celebrated the so-called victory with a parade, and never even initiated the healing?
Too many count.
We have continents full of dislocated shoulders and broken doors that were never fixed. We have generations of defenders carrying untreated moral injuries, just passing that trauma down to their kids. And what happens to a society, or to humanity as a whole, that goes fundamentally bankrupt on that moral debt?
That is the ultimate terrifying question this blueprint forces us to confront. Because if we default on the debt, the system eventually collapses entirely.
It's heavy, but it is so essential. We hope this exploration of Point 14 has given you a new lens, a new architecture of constraint to view the world around you. Keep questioning the narratives you hear, keep unpacking the things that seem simple or binary, and we will catch you on the next deep dive. Take care.